I bought the shop for shelter. Then the lathe drawer knew my name.
He was 19 and homeless. No room, no wages, no family key, just a canvas tool roll and $5 he had kept folded behind his grandmother's truck title. And with that $5, he bought a forgotten wooden button turning shop outside Bennington in Bennington County, Vermont, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1978. The north sill had split beneath the wall. 3 belt pulleys had rusted solid overhead. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But beneath the treadle lathe waited a narrow drawer, unopened for 43 years, holding wrapped button cards, old names, and enough hidden money to alter the shape of his life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Miles Avery had been preserving his whole life without knowing it. As a boy, he saved bent nails in tobacco tins, straightened them against a stone, and sorted them by length on the porch steps. He kept cracked handles, dull blades, and wooden spools, others discarded. Nothing seemed finished merely because it was worn. If an object had once answered a hand, Miles believed it might answer again. His mother, Elaine, measured safety by obedience. Bills stacked by due date, curtains shut before dark, questions swallowed before they became arguments. She loved him through packed lunches and mended cuffs, but fear had trained her to stand nearest the person holding the keys. The one person who never hurried him was his grandfather, Silas Avery. Every Saturday through the long Vermont winters, Miles crossed the frozen yard to Silas's shed, where maple shavings gathered around the treadle lathe like pale feathers. Silas turned coat buttons when snow closed the roads. He showed Miles how to saw end-grain blanks from sugar maple, press each disc onto a narrow mandrel, and bring the gouge inward without forcing it. The rim had to be shallow enough not to catch wool. 2 thread holes were drilled against scrap wood, so the bit would not tear the back. At noon, they ate cheese sandwiches beside the stove, then warmed beeswax in a tin cup and polished each button until the grain held an amber light. "A useful thing should not ask who deserves it," Silas once said, sliding 6 buttons into an envelope for a widow near Shaftesbury. Miles understood the action. The envelope held no bill. Silas died in March when Miles was 14, after 3 cold days in an Albany hospital. By the time the family returned to the shed, Uncle Grant had sold the lathe, mandrels, gauges, and maple stock to a dealer from Troy. Miles found 3 loose buttons beneath the bench, wrapped them in cloth, and kept them in his tool roll. Grant Avery took control slowly. He began with passwords, then keys, then the habit of answering questions meant for other people. He spoke quietly, almost kindly, making refusal seem like a defect in whoever resisted. After Miles's grandmother died, Grant redirected the mail and announced that her Chevrolet belonged with the family business, though the title carried Miles's name in deliberate blue ink. On November 3, 2022, rain tapped the kitchen window while Grant placed a transfer form beside the sugar bowl. Miles's mother sat at the far end of the table, both hands around an empty mug. The truck key lay between them, its rubber head worn smooth by his grandmother's thumb. "Sign it now, or take your things outside." Grant did not raise his voice. Miles folded the form twice and placed it beneath the key. Elaine looked at the paper, then at his wet jacket hanging by the stove. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. When he lifted the canvas tool roll from its hook, she turned the mug so its chipped side faced the wall. He left with the roll, 2 shirts and a feed sack, and the 3 maple buttons. The truck stayed behind, blocked by Grant's tractor. Its title, folded into quarters, remained beneath the felt liner of Miles's right boot. For 6 weeks he moved by the cheapest means available. He slept beneath a church stairwell in North Bennington, then bought a $9 hostel bunk in Troy, and woke with $31. 2 nights followed in the Albany bus station, his tool roll looped through one arm. He washed in library restrooms, ate oatmeal from paper cups, and learned which laundromat stayed warm after attendants left. By Thanksgiving, he had reached Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and slept inside a delivery van, waiting for scrap. His money fell to $18, then $11. One day, unloading flour raised it to $23, but no room cost so little. He walked north along Route 7, sleeping beneath a Williamstown picnic shelter, and later in a hay barn, with his boots under his coat. By December's second week, $5 remained. He stopped touching it. The Bennington Free Library opened at 10. Miles entered with sleet drying on his shoulders and chose a chair beside the radiator. He read employment notices, auctions, then county disposals printed near the legal advertisements. One line had been circled in pencil. Abandoned wooden turning shop. Parcel 18B. Structure as is. $5 sealed claim. County clerk, an elderly librarian with silver hair held by 2 brown pins, brought him a 1976 county atlas. Parcel 18B sat beyond Wallamsack Road beside a thin blue creek. 4 faded words marked the building. Avery Button Turning Works. Miles placed one of Silas's buttons over the black square on the map. It covered the building exactly. He called no one and did not return for the truck. At closing, he copied the address onto a circulation slip, tightened the cord around his tool roll, and walked toward the bus depot with the $5 bill folded flat inside his glove. By dawn, the road to the condemned shop would be under his feet. The first bus left Bennington before sunrise, carrying Miles 6 miles west through sleet, before the driver stopped beside a shuttered farm stand and pointed toward Walloomsack Road. "Closest I can put you." Miles stepped down with the canvas roll beneath his coat. The bus breathed diesel into the dark, then disappeared uphill. He walked 11 miles that day, following roads where frozen mud held the tracks of logging trucks. By evening, the temperature had fallen to 18 degrees. He found an open hay barn beyond Old Bennington and slept between square bales, using his feed sack beneath his head and keeping the $5 bill inside his shirt. At dawn, frost silvered the rafters. His breath had stiffened the collar of his coat. He reached Bennington shortly after 9, moving past the Blue Bend Diner, the Bennington Bookshop, Knapp's Music Store, Henry's Market, and a narrow hardware store called Bell & Sons, where coal scuttles and snow shovels stood beneath a striped awning. Delivery vans idled along Main Street. The smell of coffee drifted from a doorway, but Miles kept walking until he found the county offices inside a brick building with granite steps. Warm air struck his face when he entered. He stood near the radiator until the ache returned to his fingers, then approached a high counter where a woman in a green cardigan examined a stack of deeds. Her gray hair was cut evenly at her jaw, and a silver pencil rested behind one ear. The brass nameplate before her read, "Margaret L. Pike, County Clerk." Miles unfolded the circulation slip. "I came about parcel 18B, but Margaret Pike looked first at the slip, then at his wet boots. The button shop." Yes, ma'am. You brought the claim amount?" He laid the $5 bill on the counter. It was soft at the folds and stained faintly blue from his glove. Mrs. Pike did not touch it. She opened a ledger, found a typed notice clipped inside, and read each line before looking at him again. "You understand the structure is condemned?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no inspected well?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county will provide no repairs?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand demolition begins after the spring thaw?" "Yes, ma'am." The clerk held his gaze for several seconds, perhaps waiting for the certainty to loosen. When it did not, she removed the pencil from behind her ear and wrote his name across a yellow claim sheet. "Identification?" Miles handed over his learner's permit and the truck title. He kept one thumb over the vehicle description, but she had already seen it. You own a truck. On paper. She glanced at the damp feed sack hanging from his shoulder and asked no more. The county had taken the parcel for unpaid taxes after its last owner died. No bank wanted the narrow acreage because the creek flooded its lower edge, and no contractor had bid on removing the building without charging more than the land was worth. The $5 claim did not erase the condemnation order. It merely transferred responsibility for meeting the inspection deadline. Mrs. Pike turned the deed toward him. Miles signed with the silver pencil. She carried the pages to a black press near the window, slid them beneath a round brass stamp, and pulled the handle. The seal entered the paper with a dry, exact snap. She folded his bill once and placed it inside the ledger drawer. Take Route 9 west for half a mile, she said. Turn onto Walloomsac Road, pass the old paper mill, then follow the unmarked lane after the second stone bridge. The property begins at the walnut trees. Miles gathered the deed, but Mrs. Pike had not released the final page. Avery, she said. Was Silas Avery related to you? The room seemed to become quieter around the radiator's ticking pipes. He was my grandfather. The clerk lowered herself into the chair behind the counter. With one finger, she touched the name on his identification. When I was a girl, my father lost 2 fingers at the mill. He could still work, but buttons were difficult for him. Your grandfather made larger ones for every shirt and coat he owned. Flat-backed maple, wide holes, no charge. Miles looked toward the windows. Snowmelt had begun to move down the glass. He never mentioned that. He would not have. Mrs. Pike opened another drawer and removed a small button attached to a square of faded blue cloth. Its rim had been turned low, and one edge bore a dark crescent, where years of fingers had polished the wax away. My father kept this after the shirt wore through. She placed it in Miles's palm. The diameter was larger than the 3 buttons inside his tool roll, yet the shallow groove was unmistakable. Silas had always cut that groove with a narrow skew, pausing once before the final pass. Mrs. Pike pushed the deed across the counter. Inspection is May 1st, she said. Make the roof safe before anything else. Outside, the sleet had changed to light rain. Miles followed Route 9 past the brick shell of the old mill and turned onto Walloomsac Road. The river moved beside him, brown and fast beneath shelves of ice. After the second bridge, an elderly man in a canvas coat stood beside a mailbox, holding a black dog by its collar. You looking for the Avery place? Miles nodded. The man released the dog, which trotted forward, smelled the tool roll, and returned without barking. Lane's nearly gone, the neighbor said. Keep the creek on your left. Name's Emmett Hale. Miles Avery. At the surname, Emmett removed his cap, rubbed the flattened hair beneath it, and replaced it. Well, he said, that explains something. He pointed beyond a bend where 6 walnut trees stood in a deliberate row. Their trunks were black with rain, and last year's husks lay crushed beneath the weeds. Miles thanked him and continued alone. The lane narrowed until thorn canes scraped his sleeves. Then the shop appeared behind the trees. It was a timber-framed building sided with weathered clapboards, approximately 24 feet long and 16 wide. The roof sagged above the north wall, where several cedar shingles had fallen away and exposed gray felt. A short brick chimney leaned an inch toward the creek. Over the front door hung a wooden sign, its remaining letters barely visible beneath lichen. Avery Button Turning Works Miles stood beneath it while rain tapped the hollow shingles. The key supplied by the county turned only halfway. He worked a drop of machine oil from his tool roll into the lock and waited before trying again. The bolt withdrew with a hard scrape. Cold wood and mouse nesting met him first. The air tasted of mineral dust. When he pushed the door wider, A leather drive belt hanging from the ceiling shifted and gave a soft, dry complaint. Rain entered behind him, darkening the floorboards one drop at a time. The front room held a counter, 3 open shelves, and a small iron stove red with surface rust. Beneath the stairs, shallow bins contained hundreds of unfinished maple blanks, some clean and pale, others bitten into crescents. Miles picked one up. It smelled faintly sweet when he scraped the edge with his thumbnail. The back room was the workshop. A treadle lathe stood beneath the east window, its flywheel rimmed with dust and its belt pulley frozen overhead. The iron treadle resisted his boot, then moved less than an inch. On the wall hung outlines where tools had once been stored. He ran his fingers across one pale shape, the length of a turning gouge. Near the chimney, water had entered through the roof and swelled 2 floorboards. Elsewhere, the planks held. Miles tested them with his heel, listening for hollow places. Something moved inside the wall, followed by the papery rustle of a nest. The room smelled of old wax, wet ash, and maple that had waited through too many winters. He found the well behind the shop, capped with a warped board, and an outhouse leaning toward the creek. Neither could be trusted after dark. He returned before the light failed, closed the shutters that remained, and spread his coat on the front room floor. For supper, he ate the last heel of bread from his feed sack. The rain strengthened. Water struck a metal pail in the workshop at slow, uneven intervals, and wind passed through the broken glazing with a thin whistle. Miles placed the 3 buttons beside the larger one Mrs. Pike had given him. Then he laid the stamped deed beneath the canvas tool roll so no draft could lift it. He slept with one hand resting on the wood. Some things survive by waiting for careful hands. On the first morning, Miles pried the warped board from the well and lowered a clean mason jar on a length of sash cord. The water rose clear, but carried a metallic taste, so he marked the cap with charcoal and walked to Emmett Hale's pump for drinking water. The outhouse door required a new leather hinge cut from his tool roll. By the 3rd day, he knew which floorboard complained beside the stove, which one clicked beneath the stairs, and which long plank near the lathe remained silent no matter where he stepped. He spent daylight clearing passages through the rooms. Mouse nests went into a feed sack. Ruined maple blanks fed a burn pile away from the shop, though he saved every disc that still held solid grain. At night he slept nearer the stove and listened to the building settle under frost. On the 4th day, he returned to Bell & Sons Hardware. The store smelled of rope, lamp oil, and iron, rubbed by generations of hands. Wooden drawers climbed the walls behind the counter, each labeled in black pencil. The owner, Walter Bell, had one eyebrow white and the other dark, as if winter had reached only half his face. He watched Miles set 3 coins and 2 folded bills beside a chimney brush. "You are the boy at the Avery shop. I own the paper." Walter examined him for a moment, then drew a narrow ledger from beneath the counter. "You need more than $5 can carry. I can work it off. You can pay when the roof stops leaking." Walter wrote Miles Avery across the top of a blank page and placed a thin, grease-marked manual beside the ledger. The cover read, "Repairing the Small Farmhouse, 1948 edition." "Free," he said, "because the chimney chapter is honest." Miles bought a 6-inch wire flue brush for $4.35, 20 feet of braided rope for $1.80, a steel putty knife for 95 cents, stove cement for $2.10, a box of cut nails for $3.60, and 2 pounds of cornmeal for 72 cents. Walter entered everything except the food in the account book. Do not light that stove until daylight shows through. Miles carried the supplies beneath his coat. The chimney's clean-out door had rusted shut. He tapped its edges with the handle of the putty knife until the scale released, then caught the falling soot in a wash basin. From the roof, he He tied the brush to the rope and lowered it 6 inches at a time, twisting clockwise so the bristles would not unscrew from the fitting. The first pass stopped above the smoke chamber. He pulled harder. Something gave. A black mass dropped through the flue and struck the basin with the weight of wet earth. It was creosote glazed nearly smooth, mixed with twigs and the papery remains of a starling nest. Miles worked for 5 hours, brushing downward, scraping from below, then brushing again. He sealed 2 hairline gaps in the stovepipe with cement and waited until the following morning. When he finally held a mirror beneath the cleanout, a clean oval of winter sky appeared at the top. He built the first fire from dry walnut twigs and 2 split maple blanks too damaged to save. Smoke hesitated at the stove door, then lifted through the pipe without returning. The iron ticked as it warmed. Rust gave off a bitter odor, but the room began to change around the small heat. Miles boiled water in a dented enamel pan Walter had loaned him. He stirred cornmeal with salt and ate the porridge sitting on the floor, his back against the stove wall. Steam rose into his face. It was the first hot meal he had made for himself in more than a week. The workroom waited until the fire had dried its boards. He began at the west wall. There were 2 shallow turning gouges darkened with oil, a hand-cranked drill press with a 3-jaw chuck, a box of tapered steel mandrels, and a wooden gauge cut with circles from 3/8 to 1 1/4 inches. Beneath the window rested a beeswax pot with a crust of amber wax still clinging to its rim. A canvas apron hung from a peg, stiff with age. On the lathe bench sat a tin of brad point bits and a small brass divider whose points met exactly. The treadle lathe itself was better than it looked. Its cast iron flywheel had surface rust, but no cracked spokes. The headstock turned a fraction when Miles applied penetrating oil, though the leather belt above had hardened into a crooked oval. Beneath the bed ran the narrow drawer with a blackened wooden pull. It opened 4 inches and stopped. Miles cleared mouse droppings from beneath it and tried again. The drawer felt too heavy for its size. He removed the 2 guide screws, supported the bottom with one hand, and eased it forward. Something inside shifted without rattling. The rear panel sounded wrong when he tapped it. Most of the drawer answered with a light maple knock. The final 6 inches gave back a lower, closed sound. Miles weighed the empty front in his palms, then the back. The balance drew sharply toward the concealed end. A thin cedar disc sat beneath the drawer lining, fitted so closely that its edge resembled part of the grain. He worked the point of the brass divider into a shallow notch and lifted. The smell came first: cedar, dry paper, and old metal. Inside lay 3 parcels wrapped in brown cloth and tied with linen thread. A flat packet of button cards rested above them, each card holding 6 finished maple buttons under crossed cotton string. Names had been written across the tops in careful ink. Mrs. Ellen Crow, Mill Road, Anna Phelps, 3 children. Lucy Marr, Factory House. Number 8, besides several names, the price column had been left blank. Others carried the same notation: no charge, winter. Miles sat on the floor before opening anything else. The first parcel contained tools: a narrow skew chisel with a hornbeam handle, 2 small hook tools, a centering punch, and a steel thickness gauge marked in 64ths. Each blade had been coated with wax before wrapping. Beneath them lay a paper envelope holding sugar maple blanks, their growth rings tight and even. The second parcel held raw material and finished work. There were discs of maple, birch, applewood, and black walnut, along with 14 button cards tied together by faded blue ribbon. One card bore Silas Avery's name in a younger hand. The final parcel was a rectangular tin box with a hinged lid. Miles carried it to the front room and set it inside the circle of stove light. The latch lifted without resistance. On top lay a sealed letter, addressed only to The one who opens this drawer. He did not open it. Under the letter were cloth rolls heavy with coins and bundles of currency bound by paper bands. Miles brought the wash basin closer and counted on its clean metal surface, moving each sum from left to right. There were silver Morgan dollars, Barber half-dollars, Mercury dimes, and worn Lincoln cents, along with folded bills from several decades. One cloth pouch held foreign coins brought home by soldiers or mill workers, Canadian cents, a French franc, and a Belgian 5-centime piece pierced near the rim. At the bottom lay a purple heart in a small black case. The reverse was engraved Elias W. Avery, and beneath the metal rested a service ribbon marked 1944. Miles counted twice. The total came to $26,415. He wrote the number on the back of a ruined button card, then counted once more, grouping the coins by denomination and the bills by value. The same odd total remained. Outside, evening had lowered across the creek. Miles returned everything to the tin except the purple heart and the sealed letter. He set those beside the stove, fed one piece of walnut into the fire, and watched its bark draw inward. The envelope seemed brighter than the objects around it. He could have opened it then. Instead, he wrapped the money again, replaced the cedar disc, and carried the drawer beneath his sleeping coat. He put the metal and letter inside his tool roll. Then he stepped through the back door. The creek had risen with the day's thaw and moved black beneath the bare walnut trees. Patches of ice turned slowly near the bank, catching the last gray light before passing under the bridge. Miles stood with his hands in his pockets until the cold entered his sleeves. He watched the water carry what it could and curve around what it could not. Some things survive by waiting for careful hands. Morning entered through the east window as a pale strip across the lathe bed. Miles reheated yesterday's cornmeal, washed the spoon, and only then opened the tool roll. The handwriting on the envelope leaned slightly forward, each capital cut with a deliberate lower stroke. He had seen the same hand on the old button cards and on the name Silas Avery beneath a faded blue ribbon. He warmed his fingers near the stove before breaking the seal. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the drawer, then the shop has outlasted me, and perhaps everyone who knew why it was kept. My name is Ruth Eleanor Avery. Dr. Samuel Wexler at Albany Hospital has told me the pain beneath my ribs is pancreatic cancer, and that I should arrange what remains. I am writing from Bennington on February 6th, 1979. The doctor has given me months, but winter has taught this family not to measure only by calendars. Our line in this work began with Josiah Avery, born in 1819 near Brattleboro, who turned horn toggles before settling here in 1848. His daughter Martha Avery Bell, born in 1851, changed the shop to maple buttons when cloth mills opened along the river. Martha's son Elias Avery, born here in 1878, fitted the treadle lathe you see now and kept it running until the First World War. I was born in 1902 and learned at Elias's side. My nephew Silas, born in 1927 in Shaftesbury, was the fourth generation to carry the work into winter. The trade closed on October 17, 1946. My brother Elias William Avery did not return from France. He was killed near Saint-Lô in July 1944 while serving with the United States Army. The Purple Heart belongs to him. After the war, factories stamped buttons faster and cheaper than any patient hand could turn them. The belts came down. The shop was silent for more than 32 years. Still, a craft should be left with instructions. Use straight-grained sugar maple and cut the blanks across the end grain no thicker than 5/16 of an inch. Center each one before tightening the mandrel, because a poor center cannot be corrected by polishing. Turn the shallow rim at no more than 900 revolutions per minute. Drill 2 holes, 1/8 of an inch wide, spaced 3/16 apart, with scrap wood behind the blank. Warm beeswax to about 140 degrees. Mix 3 parts wax with 1 part boiled linseed oil and rub it on while the button is still warm from turning. Let the finish rest 12 hours before buffing. The money was not earned by buttons alone. Some came from boarders, some from maple timber, and some from wages I saved during the war. The cards explained what mattered more. Factory widows came here with coats missing closures and children growing faster than wages. I did not charge them, neither did my father when he could help it. Inheritance is not the keeping of an object because it is old. It is learning the work well enough to know what must be repaired, what must be spent, and what should remain for the hands that follow. Use little, waste less. Make something honest. Behind the shop, beyond the walnut nearest the creek, you will find a flat fieldstone marked with a circle crossed by 2 small holes. My father carved it when the first maple button was made here. Keep the grass from covering it. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Ruth Eleanor Avery. February 6th, 1979. Miles read the letter once without moving. Then he read it again, slower at the instructions, placing 1 finger beneath each measurement. When he finished, he folded the pages along Ruth's original creases, rather than making new ones. The envelope had softened at one corner. He returned the letter to it and held it between both palms until the stove settled with a low iron click. He took the rear path while frost still held the ground. The nearest walnut grew at the edge of the creek, its roots exposed where spring water had eaten the bank. Beyond it, beneath burdock stems and dead grass, Miles found a flat stone almost level with the soil. He cleared it with the putty knife and brushed away the final dirt with his glove. A circle had been carved into the gray surface. 2 narrow holes crossed its center. The mark was simple enough to miss unless a person knew the weight of a button between finger and thumb. Miles knelt beside it. Water moved behind him, touching ice beneath the bank with the faint sound of glass laid upon wood. He did not speak. Inside, he opened the black case and set the purple heart beside the button cards. The stove fire was low. Miles placed Ruth's beeswax pot on its top and waited until the amber crust softened around the edges. He lowered one of Silas's 3 buttons into the warmth, lifted it with the point of the centering punch, and polished it against the old canvas apron. The maple darkened beneath his fingers. That afternoon, small acts returned to him in the order his hands remembered them. The librarian bringing the county atlas without asking why his coat was wet. The bus driver carrying him beyond the ordinary stop. Emmett Hale filling 2 jars from his pump and leaving them at the lane. Walter Bell writing his name into a credit ledger before Miles had earned $1. None of them had offered a speech. Each had noticed one practical need and answered it. There may be someone watching who still remembers a winter like that. What was one small kindness you received when you had nothing useful to offer in return? Tell us who gave it and what simple thing they placed in your hands. Night came clear and colder. Miles wrapped the heirloom tools in Ruth's brown cloth and placed them beside his coat. The letter rested beneath the 4 maple buttons. He lay facing them while moonlight crossed the floor, and for the first time since leaving home, he slept without looping the tool roll around his arm. The first snow came on December 2nd. 6 inches laid evenly over the walnut roots in the collapsed lane. Miles read the roofing chapter in Walter Bell's manual 3 times beside the stove, tracing each drawing with a dirty thumbnail before he carried a ladder outside. The shop roof measured 26 feet from eave to eave and 18 along the ridge. Allowing for overlap and waste, he calculated 12 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 14 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Walter extended the account without comment, then reached beneath the counter and brought out a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a notched blade. "My brother used this," he said. "Bring it back sharp." Emmett Hale sent a former roofer named Franklin Cobb, a narrow 80-year-old with a copper hearing aid and a habit of testing every ladder rung twice. Franklin refused money by closing Miles's fingers around the offered bills. Keep it for dry timber. They worked 11 days. The rotted north rafter received a sister cut from straight spruce, bolted beside the damaged timber rather than replacing it outright. Franklin snapped a chalk line across the felt, blue dust lifting in the cold, and showed Miles the 3-stroke method. 1 tap to set, 1 to drive, 1 lighter stroke to seat the nail without splitting the shingle. On the 4th morning, Franklin pointed with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." Miles reached for this hammer. "Pull it." By mid-December, the ridge was capped. The eaves ran straight, and snow no longer entered the back room. Miles stood beneath the finished roof during a hard evening rain and listened. Nothing struck the pale. January opened with powdered mortar gathering on the hearth each morning. Several chimney bricks had begun to spall, their fired faces loosening in thin red shells. Miles removed only what failed beneath the pressure of his thumb, numbered the sound bricks in chalk, and laid them on the floor in order. Walter helped him mix hydraulic lime with screened sand, then add fire clay for the flue joints at a ratio of 1 part fire clay to 3 parts lime mortar. The mix had to hold on the trowel without shining wet. Too much water, Walter warned, would freeze before the bond formed. For 3 weeks, Miles worked while daytime temperatures remained in the 20s. He kept the mortar bucket near a shielded lamp and warmed each replacement brick beside the stove before setting it. His bare hands went numb every 15 minutes, gloves being too clumsy for the narrow joints. He would stop, hold his fingers under his arms until they hurt again, then return to the scaffold. The upper courses were rebuilt around a plumb line. He installed a new clay thimble, repointed the smoke chamber, and sealed the crown with a slight slope, so meltwater would run away from the flue. On January 29th, he lit a test fire with newspaper, pine kindling, and 1 split of maple. A ribbon of smoke rose immediately. Outside, it left the chimney in a clean gray column and did not curl beneath the eaves. Franklin watched from the walnut trees, nodded once, and went home. The floors looked worse after the roof stopped leaking. Dirt had hidden the depth of the wear, and 2 white pine planks near the lathe had split along hand-cut rose-head nails. Miles lifted them carefully, sistered the joist below, and reset the old boards with their scars facing upward. He rented a random orbit sander from Bell & Sons for $14 a day. Walter gave him 1 day free when the creek road iced over and the machine could not be returned. Miles made 3 passes across the front and back rooms, 80 grit to remove grime and raised fibers, 120 to settle the scratches, then 220 along the grain by hand near the walls. Fine pine dust entered his sleeves and coated his eyelashes. Each evening he vacuumed the boards, wiped them with a barely damp cloth, and waited for the grain to dry. The first oil coat vanished into the wood almost as soon as he spread it. The second remained long enough to level with a cotton rag. After the third, he closed the doors and allowed a full 48-hour cure. The board shifted from dull brown and dark honey toward the color of old mahogany, though the nail head stayed black and exact. One morning he could not begin. The sander sat unplugged beside the stove, while he walked to the marsh beyond the creek. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless, except when wind lifted the feathers along its back. Miles watched until it opened its wings and crossed the bare trees. He did no work that day. The following morning he swept the floor and continued. There were 8 windows in the shop. 3 held no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner, and one preserved its original pane from 1788, green at the edges and rippled enough to bend the walnut trees outside. Miles marked that sash with red pencil and worked around it. He removed the failed putty with the roofing hatchet warmed near the stove, keeping the blade almost flat so it would not bruise the muntins. New panes were bedded in D-Ape 33 glazing putty rolled between his palms, pressed into the rabbet, and secured with glazier's points before the outer bevel was drawn in one continuous pass. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Miles replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot through the counterweight eye. He tested every sash before reinstalling the stops. A window had to remain wherever the hand left it, neither falling nor climbing. The last opening faced east. As Miles pressed the final putty line smooth, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch beyond the glass. Its feet closed around the wet black twig, and its head turned toward the room as though inspecting the work. Miles held still until it flew. Then he cleaned the pane with folded newspaper, lowered the sash, and heard the latch meet cleanly for the first time in decades. The walls became honest once the windows held. Horsehair plaster clung to hand-split oak lath in broad surviving fields, but near the chimney 3 patches failed in succession. The first slumped before evening, the second cracked around the edges. The third dried too quickly and fell in one pale sheet when Miles touched it. Walter brought an old burlap bag from his barn. Coarse horsehair lay inside, saved from his father's upholstery work. Miles mixed it into lime plaster until the fibers crossed each trowelful. He pressed a scored scratch coat through the lath, waited until it held beneath his thumb, then added a 3/8-inch brown coat and allowed it 72 hours to cure. The final coat measured 1/8 of an inch, worked smooth with a damp wooden float. He stood back from the repaired wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Bellamy owned the cafe near the library and wore a flower handprint across one hip of her black apron. Twice a week she left a paper bag on the shop step. Soup in a jar, rye bread, sometimes 2 boiled eggs wrapped in waxed paper. When Miles carried coins to the cafe, she pushed his hand away with the edge of a menu. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." He did not explain that it had never made candles. Doris had already turned toward the grill. Caleb Morse arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, long-wristed, and missing the top button from his coat. Without introducing himself, he began dividing the maple rounds beside the woodshed into stove lengths. Miles offered him $2. Caleb shook his head and drove them all into a knot. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He stayed until the pile stood beneath canvas, then rode home with one trouser cuff trapped in his bicycle chain. Reverend Boyd passed each morning in a brown hat polished by rain. He never entered unless invited. He tipped the brim, carried away one sack of broken lath at a time, and on the coldest day placed 2 gloved fingers against the doorframe. "Keep these hands steady, Lord." Then he continued toward town. Miles postponed the cellar until February 11th, when the ground outside had frozen deeply enough that seepage slowed along the foundation. The door beneath the stairs opened onto 7 granite steps, each hollowed at the center by old boots. Below them lay a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. Shelves leaned against the north wall, and empty preserving jars stood beneath gray cloth. At the center rested a dressed granite slab, square-edged, and unlike the surrounding stones. The same button mark appeared on its surface, a circle crossed by 2 narrow holes. Miles swept around it, but did not lift it. Under the 3rd step, his broom struck wood. A small oak box had been wedged behind the riser, protected by a strip of tarred cloth. Inside lay a brass key, whose bow had been shaped like a 4-hole wooden button. Beneath the key was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the shop before the walnut trees had reached the roof line. Her sleeves were rolled above her wrists. She held a narrow turning gouge against her apron, and the set of her mouth, the distance between her eyes, even the slight bend of one ear carried Miles's own face through another century. On the back, scratched into the metal, were the words, Martha Avery Bell, daughter of Josiah Avery, age 25, summer of 1903. Miles carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside Elias's medal. He tried it in the desk, the lathe drawer, the old exterior lock, and the iron cash box behind the counter. It fit nothing. There it remained. Snow retreated first from the south wall, leaving wet leaves pressed flat against the foundation. The creek grew loud with mountain runoff. Walnut catkins lengthened above the lane, and sunlight reached places inside the shop that winter had kept gray. Miles decided not to begin the full craft that spring. He chose one worn silver coin from Ruth's cache and exchanged it for maple stock, a new drill bit, and a strip of belt leather. He practiced only on small samples, learning again how pressure changed the grain and how quickly a careless tool could spoil a centered blank. Most attempts went into the stove. A few remained on the bench. The house was patient. So was he. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Miles finished the first button he was willing to place on a card. He had cut the blank from straight-grained sugar maple, centered it twice, and turned the rim at 870 revolutions per minute. The thread holes emerged clean against the backing block. He warmed Ruth's wax mixture on the stove, 3 parts beeswax to 1 part boiled linseed oil, and rubbed it into the wood until the growth rings darkened like lines beneath clear water. The button measured 7/8 of an inch. He sewed it onto Caleb's old coat. By then the restored interior carried no resemblance to abandonment, though Miles had preserved every mark that belonged. The white pine floors held their dark amber finish. The 8 windows opened freely. Turning tools rested in their pale wall outlines, and the repaired plaster curved gently where old trowel strokes had survived. The lathe belt moved without slap. The chimney drew cleanly. Above the counter, Ruth's button cards remained tied in faded blue ribbon. The brass key waited until the following April. Miles found the lock by accident while pruning dead growth from the largest walnut beside the creek. A patch of bark near the rear of the trunk sounded flat beneath the wooden handle of his saw. He cleared moss from a narrow brass plate fixed low between 2 roots. At its center was a keyhole, shaped to accept the button-bowed key. The plate opened inward. Inside the tree was a dry cavity lined with hammered tin. Miles reached into it and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The outer layer cracked at the folds, but had kept the contents untouched. A 48-star American flag lay inside, folded into a small triangle. Beneath it rested a note in Martha Avery Bell's handwriting, dated November 11th, 1918. She wrote that the armistice bells had sounded from Bennington before noon. Her younger brother had returned from France with a wounded shoulder, and a silence that made ordinary rooms difficult for him. Martha placed the flag in the walnut because he had asked that no one hang it above a doorway or use it in a parade. He says a flag should sometimes be kept quietly, she had written, until the dead and the living can rest beneath the same weather. Miles carried the bundle inside and unfolded nothing further. He built a shallow walnut case with acid-free cloth beneath the flag, then fixed Martha's note behind glass beside it. Elias's Purple Heart was taken to the Vermont Veterans Home Cemetery in Bennington on July 15th, the anniversary of his death near St. Lo. Miles did not arrange a ceremony. He cleaned the marker, placed the medal there for 1 hour, and sat beneath a maple while rain darkened the stone. Before leaving, he returned the medal to its case. Of the $26,415, Miles used only 4 coins. 1 bought the first maple stock and belt leather. 2 paid for a replacement lathe bearing made by a machinist in Rutland. The 4th covered glass for the flag case. The remaining money went back into the tin box with an updated inventory. Miles sealed the cloth rolls in waxed paper and returned them to the drawer beneath the treadle lathe. On top, he placed a card in his own handwriting. For the next one, use little, leave enough. The shop reopened without a signboard, announcement, or newspaper notice. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard, hand-turned maple buttons repairs, and matched set savory shop. Wallamsack Road, the first order came from a woman replacing 6 closures on her father's winter coat. Then a tailor requested 12 dark walnut buttons for a wool vest. By the end of January, the mailing list held 43 names written in a school notebook. Miles worked slowly. No 2 sets were completed in one sitting. Caleb returned in March, carrying a pine board beneath one arm. He had grown broad through the shoulders and now wore the repaired coat only for good. The board had been painted black, and its letters were hand-carved rather than routed. Avery Button Turning Works and Daughters Miles read the words twice. "There aren't any daughters," he said. Caleb set the sign against the counter and ran one thumb across a chisel mark. "Not yet." He explained that Ruth had run the shop, Martha before her, and factory widows had carried its buttons through entire winters. The old sign had left out most of the hands that kept the place useful. Miles did not argue. They hung Caleb's board beneath the weathered original, leaving both visible. The new pine was too pale at first, but rain and chimney smoke would settle it. That evening, Miles opened Ruth's letter and placed a clean sheet beside it. He sharpened a pencil with Silas's old pocket knife, catching the shavings in his palm. The opening took no invention. "My dear one, whoever you are." He wrote that the roof had been repaired, the original pane preserved, and the lathe returned to work. He listed the names of those who had helped without asking what the property might someday be worth. He described where the money remained, where Martha's flag rested, and why the granite slab in the cellar had not been disturbed. Then he added instructions of his own. He wrote that winter maple should rest indoors for 14 days before cutting. A leather drive belt needed only enough tension to turn without slipping. Beeswax could be warmed gently, but never allowed to smoke. A person should discard any button whose holes had begun to split, no matter how long the turning had taken. He left several pages blank. Near midnight, the stove settled, and wind moved among the walnuts. Miles looked toward the lathe, where a finished set waited on a card bearing no price. Some things survive by waiting for careful hands. He folded his letter along 2 exact creases and placed it beneath Ruth's in the hidden drawer. Before closing the cedar disc, he added 1 maple button made from the same stock as Caleb's repaired coat. Outside, fresh snow had begun to cover the lane. The restored windows held warm squares of light against the creek, and the 2 signs moved slightly beneath the eaves. The wooden button-turning shop waits. It has always waited. In the county office, Margaret Pike retired the following spring. Her replacement emptied most of the old desk, but left 1 folded $5 bill in the rear ledger drawer, stained faintly blue and marked with the parcel number 18B. No one spent it.